Hi. So last evening when we had our politics do's and don'ts webinar, I forgot to click record from the beginning. So here I am the next day re-recording this first section. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who is seeking out these resources in this moment about how you as a military spouse or family member can get involved in both politics and activism. Because we have so many new people here, I wanted to quickly start by giving an introduction to both myself and our organization. So I'm Sarah Streyder. I'm the proud spouse of an active duty airman. I'm also the 2020 Quantico Military-Based Spouse of the Year. And I'm the founder and director of the Secure Families Initiative, which you can see from our super high-tech background. The work we do at SFI is centered around the civic engagement portion of the military family lifestyle. So our mission is to mobilize military spouses and family members as voters and advocates for their communities. And we do that in a number of ways. As you can see here, we offer free, nonpartisan online trainings on different topics related to being the best advocate you can be. Up until this series, our most popular topic had been how to tell your story to a non-military audience. But of course, politics do's and don'ts has quickly eclipsed that in terms of popularity. We also talk a lot at SFI about voting because it's such a fundamental part of engaging with government, and we think those who can vote should vote. So if you have questions about registering to vote, especially if you're an active duty family who moves around a lot, we have resources for you on our website. You're also more than welcome to reach out to us and ask. A couple weeks ago, we did a virtual Q&A with the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or FVAP, which is the DoD program that helps monitor military voting. We're hoping to do more events with them in the summer. Finally, as an organization, SFI practices what we preach. So we don't just say that it's important for military families to be advocates. We also provide direct actionable items, opportunities to take action. So at SFI, we believe it's especially important for our community to participate in our country's conversations around foreign policy, because decisions of war and peace directly impact our lives here on the home front. So we will send out action alerts on relevant items. If you become an SFI member, you can look forward to those. So that's me, that's SFI. My teammate Kate Marsh-Lord is our producer for this recording that you're going to be watching. So thank you, Kate. She is also an active duty Air Force spouse. And we really look forward to this conversation and hope you find it helpful. All right, let's do this. So today we are talking about politics while married or related to the military. But first we should probably clarify what we mean by politics. So politics encompasses a wide range of activities, starting with voting. It can mean expressing your opinions in person or online. It can mean advocating specifically for pieces of legislation, support a candidate running for office, or of course, running for office yourself. All of these is a wide range of levels of engagement that you can join. And of course, at SFI, we believe that all of these are good and important, even fun, if I may say. But we also understand that the level of engagement is going to look different for everyone. So, you know, we're going to be as motivated to inspire folks to get involved, but at the end of the day, what we want to make sure is the decision that you make about your own personal involvement is a decision that's made out of information and not fear. That's our purpose for here today. So as much as we'd love to get everyone up to running for office, because I think we all agree having some military spouse and family representation in office would be great, we recognize that's not for everyone. Now, before I move on, there is one distinction I would like to make. There is a dividing line between what I like to call capital P politics and lowercase p politics. And that distinction has to do with another P word, partisanship. Partisanship refers to the promotion of a political party or candidate for office. And those partisan political activities are the ones that the Department of Defense cares most about regulating for reasons we can all understand. Whereas there are other forms of activism that are not tied to any political party, such as participation in a social movement about anti-racism, that is not partisan political. So This distinction is going to come up later in the presentation, and I'll explain there when it does, but I wanted to flag at the very beginning the distinction that exists here so that it better understands. Before I launch into our normal presentation, I do want to take one moment to note the current time that we're in right now, because I know a lot of folks that are joining us today are doing so because they have a deep and justified outrage at the prevalence of racism in this country and want to know how they can get involved in speaking out against it. And so while we normally focus our presentation on electoral types of political activity, that partisan political activity side, we have tried our best to adjust this training to include material that's responsive to, say, participation in protests and demonstration. So just flagging that on the outset. I also want to highlight instances of leadership that we've seen exhibited in this moment. First, I'm an Air Force spouse, so I would be remiss if I didn't point out Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force Wright, who has spoken emphatically about his lived experience as a Black man in America. And along with the Air Force Chief of Staff, Goldfein, has spearheaded tough interactive conversations within the Air Force about racism. And then also last week, the Army's top civilian, enlisted, and officer leaders, all three released an open letter that affirmed Americans' constitutional rights to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. I point these out because I want to emphasize that being anti-racist does not make you partisan. And does not go against the ethos of the military. And we're so grateful to see leaders within the military setting this kind of example to demonstrate that. Okay, so now we will get into the primary portion of our presentation. For this first portion, I'm going to be talking about the official hard and fast rules that govern political activities, because that's kind of our first step. And then second, in the second half of our presentation, we're going to talk more about the squishier things like social norms and other fears and concerns that folks have that aren't so objective. So to answer this lovely fellow's question, but aren't there rules against this sort of thing? And the short answer is, for you, not really. So I'll put this in perspective. If you are a partner, spouse, family member of someone in the military, and you yourself are not in the military or otherwise a federal employee, none of the rules that are there about political activity apply to you. Whether we're talking about the Hatch Act or DoD Directive 134410, which I have read so many times I can basically see the text in my dreams, those rules do not govern you and your activities. They only govern your uniformed loved one and their activities. Now, before you think, cool, we're done, that was a weirdly short webinar, there are some ways in which your life may overlap with your service member's life, such that things you do may be misconstrued as coming from them. And those are things that you should avoid in order so that they don't get in trouble. Does that make sense? So again, rules don't apply to you, they apply to your service member, and it's just healthy to keep somewhat of a distinction between you and your person. I promise this will all be much clearer when I give you some examples right coming up, but I just wanted to make sure that we're all operating from the same correct paradigm. And before we get into specifics, it's important to note that every little rule we're going to talk about all points back toward one big overarching rule, and that's this. We should not be doing anything that gives the impression that a party or candidate is endorsed by the United States Armed Forces. Every other little rule is in place in order to avoid violating this big rule. So in practice, if you ever find yourself getting dangerously close to crossing this kind of a line, best thing you can do is to clarify with some sort of explicit disclaimer. You might see those sometimes in things that get published, like writings or photographs. You'll see a little disclaimer. It never hurts, and some people even do that for their personal social media accounts, which I'm sure I'll get to later. Okay, so big overarching principle. What does this look like in practice? And how does it affect you, the spouse, who is not part of the military? First off, if your spouse wears a uniform, they are not allowed to participate into any political activities while in uniform or official duty or on federal property, right? So how would this relate to you? Let's say you, the spouse, want to go to a presidential candidate rally. Your spouse is allowed to join you. They just have to make sure they're not on duty and they're not wearing their uniform. So just something to keep in mind as you extend that invitation to them. There is a prohibition on any political activities while on base, and this prohibition does apply to everyone. Service member, non-service member family members, even if you're someone who's not affiliated at all with the military, you just so happen to be on a base, no partisan political activities. So if, let's say, you want to host a small fundraiser for a candidate or a phone banking session, just make sure you do that off base. I know some spouses that'll have a central meeting point, like the Ruby Tuesday down the street or the Scooters Coffee right around the corner, that becomes their hub for partisan political activities that they want to get involved in. Now, here's the first situation in which the partisan political distinction comes into play, because this prohibition does not apply to other forms of volunteer organizing that are not related to a campaign. So let's say you want to gather a group of folks, you all want to go to a peaceful protest and you want to carpool and you all gather together and then leave. That would be perfectly, and you want to hang out beforehand or afterward or something and talk about things. That's perfectly acceptable because it's not a partisan political activity. One other thing for if you live on base, you are not allowed to post any partisan political signage at your place of residence. And this does include like a candidate yard sign, vote for so-and-so, not allowed. I will say two kind of clarifications here. First of all, I know in our last webinar, we indicated this prohibition may extend to residences even off base, and we did get legal clarification at high enough level that we feel comfortable sharing, and it does not. So if you live in completely private civilian housing, unaffiliated to the military, and your service member lives there with you, can have partisan political signage, including yard signs. Woohoo! The other caveat I'll just share with this one is, again, this only refers to partisan political. So if you want to, let's say, put a sign on your lawn that expresses your agreement with a certain social movement, you can do that. Be careful it doesn't cross over into, let's say, hate speech. It shouldn't be something really aggressive. But assuming, anything before that very, strict line, you are allowed to post things like that on your residence on base. Okay. So if you share a vehicle with your service member, keep in mind that they have a rule that they are not allowed to put partisan political signage on their car other than a bumper sticker. It's like this weirdly specific line in the directives. So if you outright own your car, and especially if you live off base, you can probably put more than just a bumper sticker of partisan political signage on your car. But just be aware that if your service member shares that car, or especially if you live on base and you're going to be parking your car in front of your residence frequently, the likelihood, the risk that you run that that car is seen as likely belonging to your uniformed loved one is much higher. So we would just give advice that you should probably avoid partisan political signage if your spouse shares your car with you. Same goes for if you have any sort of shared social media profile. So you have a shared Facebook account, some couples do, or a shared email account. I don't, so this doesn't apply to me, but if you do have a shared account with your loved one, they are not allowed to solicit partisan political donations, and therefore you cannot solicit partisan political donations from that platform, because again, it might be seen as coming from them. If you have your own private account, you can do whatever you like. And I should flag, your service member is allowed to donate to partisan campaigns. They just can't ask other people to do it. So I know sometimes that's a question for folks. So that, of course, extends for you. You are also allowed to donate to political campaigns. All right, so this is the part of a presentation we've added in this moment, because I know that protests and demonstrations are things that folks are interested in getting involved in. First of all, just kind of a blanket, if you are a military spouse or family member, you are allowed to participate in protests. Your service member can join you unless it violates one of a few things. I believe the directive is 1325.6. It talks about if a demonstration is likely to become violent, if participating in a protest constitutes the violation of law and order, so let's say looting, and if you're in uniform. Your service member cannot join you in a peaceful protest demonstration if it violates any one of those three things. Additionally, if you're living abroad, because I know we have some international listeners both now and later with the recording, best to check your country's specific agreement. So first of all, your service member cannot participate in a demonstration because that's the fourth item that's brought up as something that would preclude participation in an otherwise perfectly valid activity. As for you, the spouse or family member, whether that extends to you depends on what country you're in. So for example, we know folks who are stationed in Germany whose legal office has advised them that the prohibition extends to them. So if you're stationed in Germany, your SOFA or Status of Forces Agreement precludes you from participating in protests or demonstrations where you're at. However, we had someone who went to our last webinar reach out. She is currently stationed in Canada, and she is allowed to participate. The visitors agreement that we have with that country is different. So I have not read every single country's SOFA, apologies, but if you are stationed overseas, best to get that information from someone in your chain of command or your family readiness group resources, and that will be able to clarify for you what the rules are for you specifically. Finally, if you want to run for office because you can and because that'd be awesome, there are going to be some additional rules that do apply to you, the spouse, even if you're not yourself in the military. However, this is the part of the presentation where our expertise at SFI ends and another organization begins. So if you're a military spouse interested in running for office, please, I would strongly encourage you to connect with Homefront Rising, which is a great organization that helps run trainings for military spouses running for office. Usually they do an annual in-person event in DC. Obviously they couldn't do that this year. This year's was virtual, but looking forward to next year. I know they're gonna wanna get back into that. And they're just a great general resource for a lot of this information. The gals who run this come from the Military Spouse JD Network, a group of military spouse lawyers that have done fantastic work on licensing, especially in different states. So if running for office is on your agenda, please make sure you link up with them. We're more than happy to introduce if you're unable to get contact information yourself. So up until this point, I have been the Debbie Downer talking about all the things that you cannot do or should not do in order to avoid accidentally getting your service member dinged. But you should notice that the list is very small of the do nots, and there's huge potential for all the things that you in fact can do. And the purpose of the slide is not for me to read every item or you to read every item, but rather to overwhelm you with the possibilities that remain active for you, a military spouse. Of course, this list itself is not exhaustive. There's even more than I could fit on a slide, but I think it's important for folks to be reminded of that when our default setting tends to be one that's reticent to get involved. And I think that's Boulder Dash. All right, I'm about to pivot. So we're about to pivot from the hard and fast rules section of our presentation into that squishier stuff that I said that we would talk about. Like what if you're a leadership command spouse, what if social norms may exist, that sort of thing. But before I do, two things. I'm gonna make an observation, and then I am gonna open it up to any questions folks have on any of the material up until this point. So first, here's my observation. You've probably noticed that sometimes it feels like there's some ambiguity with these rules, and that's because the question about whether the rules about political activity extend to spouses and family members is a relatively modern question. it was pointed out to me the other day that it wasn't that long ago that in the military, the social expectation was that the military head of household would speak for their family. And it was less commonly conceived of that a spouse could have their own opinions or work. So the legal legacy that we've inherited on this topic is, in fact, it's less than fully clear on all counts. So what I can promise you from SFI's perspective is this: we are always going to keep digging for clarifications when we need. And if we ever do receive updated guidance, like that piece on the yard signs that we were able to clarify for folks, we will make sure to post about it on our social media and our website. So if you want to, please stay in touch. That will be the best way for us to keep communicating whatever new and best information that we get. Okay, I see in the chat, it looks like we do not have any questions so far. Okay, wow, the last group was much chattier than y'all. Either you did more reading or you saw our last recording. If that's the case, that's okay. I just want to make sure folks understand that this is available to them, both the Q&A and the chat function. So I will move on, but I will keep an eye just in case anything comes through. Sounds good? Awesome. Okay, so we've pivoted. We're talking about no longer hard and fast rules. Now we're going to be talking more about social norms. Oh, we do just have a question that came in. What about spouses clubs? Are they to remain impartial? Yeah, great question. If you, and this is going to actually come into play in a little bit when we talk about this section too. But if you have a formal role to play, let's say the leader of a key spouse, if you are a key spouse and you play some sort of leadership role within the military spouse community, depending on what entity it is that gave you that role, if it's an unaffiliated club versus, you know, a key spouse who's more directly involved with the DoD, that entity, whoever gave you that role, will be able to specify what the rules are. So if you're a key spouse, when you are acting as in your key spouse capacity, you are expected to remain partisan, politically neutral. So you shouldn't endorse a candidate or a party. However, of course, you know, I cannot emphasize enough that it doesn't mean you have to never talk about your values or things that you care about, especially if those values are things like being anti-racist, which has no political ties. So just want to make that clear. Now, if you're part of another spouse club that's unofficial, and the entity that gave you that role doesn't give you any sort of rules about that, then of course it's up to you to discern whether, when you're in your official capacity, if you want to be partisan or if you just want to maintain that as part of your personal life. I know in our last webinar, someone had a question about, okay, I'm a key spouse, or I'm the leader of a spouse club, and I use my Facebook account, my personal private Facebook account, to post about key spouse activities. Can I still, if I use that account for official work, can I also use it for my own personal political stuff? And ultimately, as far as we've been able to tell, you can do both. I would just give a suggestion that if you're going to post about something that is partisan political, don't post it in the Facebook group belonging to that club. I'd probably recommend just keeping it on your own personal timeline. And it may help to be kind of explicit, like I said, when you meet people and say, hey, just so you know, I'm a very politically motivated person. And so there may be things that you see on my Facebook that you may agree with or disagree with, but I want you to know that that doesn't change my wanting to be here for you and support you in whatever way I can. I think preempting a lot of the possible tension is the best way to resolve that kind of a distinction. And as Julie Shepard put in the chat, you can always post a disclaimer on public Facebook posts, and that's totally true, and I've seen that done. I've even seen, I know one gal whose Twitter account, she tweets a lot, but on her bio, she adds that disclaimer of, you know, my views are my own, and I think that just kind of helps you, give you extra protection. All right, so Kate says we've got a question You mentioned leadership spouses. My spouse is a general flag officer. Are there some sticky situations we should be aware of at that level? You can wait to address this and you get to leadership. I will. I will get there in a couple minutes. So hang tight with me. I've got some answers for you. And Julie mentions in the chat, as a reminder, Facebook forbids from having multiple personal accounts, but you can create a public fan page. And Julie, that's a great example of one way in which you can kind of create these distinctions in your life, which frankly might just be less of a headache. And I'll bring up why I'm saying that soon. Okay. I don't see any other questions unless I'm missing one. Nope. Okay, well, keep them coming. Happy to loop back if it's something to do more with the first half. That's fine. It's never too late. I just figured it was easier to categorize. Meanwhile, I will get going because I know that that leadership portion is important. Okay, so we're pivoting. We're talking about the squishier things now, the social norms. You know, I want us to have in this webinar some real talk about this because it's probably not going to surprise anyone on this call that the number one concern we hear from family members about whether they should be political has less to do with the official rules and more to do with violating certain social norms and the fear that you might upset someone in your spouse's chain of command and then they decide to be petty and it somehow reflects back on your uniformed loved one. And if this isn't a fear that you have had, it's probably a fear you've heard someone else have. So I think it's a relevant conversation for us to have regardless. So I'm going to take the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this, but I will say this is not as objective, right or wrong kind of question and answer as the first legal stuff is. Ultimately, it does come down to a judgment call, and I'll get to that in a sec. But here are my thoughts. First of all, any of the stuff that we focus on here at SFI is all nonpartisan. So if we send you an action item, you should feel confident that, you know, the things that we talk about and promote here at SFI are completely compatible, even encouraged within the military ethos, like voting and like telling your story and making sure political leadership understands the impacts that their decisions have on our families. All of that is all well and good, and you should feel very, very comfortable with that. Second of all, in terms of my thoughts, you are an independent entity from your spouse. Your beliefs, opinions, and extracurricular activities are truly yours and yours alone. I know that not everyone always sees it that way, and there is sometimes a bit of an old school perspective that you are an extension of your spouse. But I do believe that mindset to be one that is fading from view as we see more and more military spouses working outside the home as one example of kind of spearheading their own frontier, getting involved in other, you know, volunteer work and community service. I think folks are beginning to better understand spouses as being their own people. And the results speak for themselves. So the overwhelming majority of stories that I've heard from the many military spouses I know are ones that are positive. They are of people who are out and proud about their core political values. They are expressive of those and have been for a long time and have never themselves faced what we might call retribution, either official or unofficial. Of course, I have heard the occasional horror story. I'm not trying to pretend there aren't leaders out there who are petty, like I said, but those are much further and fewer between. So even if, let's say, you don't know personally or see that many political spouses yourself, I can assure you that we are out there and you are, in fact, not alone. I'll add, sometimes tone can go a long way. Hear me out. So I discovered early on when I was showing our SFI website, our blog posts to my parents who have no military affiliation other than their son-in-law. And I realized that it was really easy for them to hear what I was saying, which at times was very justified criticisms or complaints, as being disrespectful, when in fact they were not. I think there's like an overcompensation that can happen, especially when your audience is non-military. And I found that when I reminded them the reason why I was advocating for change, that it's because I love the military as an institution and this country, and I want them both to be the best that they can be. Sharing that reminder can be a helpful way for folks to hear what I am saying and not hear things that I'm not saying. We all want the military to continue to be a place where good people want to work, right? That's itself a national security issue. And so you shouldn't have to clarify that. That should be a given. But in cases that this is a strategic add-on, that by adding a clarification, it helps you, I just wanted to make sure to pass that advice along based on my own experience. And finally, at the end of the day, it's a personal choice. It's up to you and how comfortable you feel, and it's best to just talk with your family. What is your policy going to be on political engagement? And it's okay for that to change. I think a lot of us are on a journey, and there might be situations where we feel more or less comfortable, and things that might affect that, current events might inspire you to get more or less involved. Based on where your duty station is, you might feel more supported or less, and that's okay. Also, leadership role, and that's where I'm going to touch on this right now. I know, so I will just flag, I have never been a command spouse, but I do have friends who have, and I've reached out to them and I've had conversations with them about this topic. And this is what, and I'll talk about one friend I have in particular, because she's a very passionate political person. I spoke with her and she said that, so first of all, the technical rules have never changed for her, even as her husband has promoted up the ranks. So right now her spouse is at the battalion command level, and it's not like she had to all of a sudden sign another form that said, okay, now there are rules about what she can say or can do. No, nothing like that. But she has made a choice to refrain from explicit political content. And I'm talking, person she votes for, party she believes in, just that kinds of stuff. She has refrained from posting at just for her own personal kind of self-care sake, because in her words, people can be petty. And what does change the further up the ranks you go is the number of eyeballs that are scrutinizing your activity, and the number of possible people who might want to hassle you in your life. So even if there's no legal hard and fast standing that they would have to point a finger and say, hey, wrong, it doesn't mean that they can't still hassle you. And if you're in a leadership position and you feel like posting something or saying something or whatever would just bring extra stress on you and your family's life, I think it's a perfectly valid personal choice to refrain from that for your sake. So, I will again emphasize talking about political movement or social movements and general values and principles should never be something that anyone has a problem with or gets someone in trouble. So we're really just talking about the partisan political at this point. And I'll also just add, she volunteered herself to be a point of contact, somewhat of a mentor for any other leadership spouses that want to be able to talk through this in more detail. She did volunteer herself. So if that applies to you, please shoot us an email after this, and I'd love to put you in touch because she's great. And I think she would have a lot of wisdom to share just beyond what I'm able to paraphrase. So again, the rules don't change, but you may feel that the context warrants just different behavior, and that's totally okay. I will say that if someone to your face says that being politically active or being an advocate is somehow antithetical to the military ethos, I couldn't disagree more, and here's why. At SFI, we believe that telling our stories is one of the most patriotic ways we as spouses and family members can support our service members. At its core, that's what political advocacy is. It's storytelling. It's relaying facts about how policies have affected our lives and relaying them to leadership so they fully understand the downstream effects of their decisions. We know the military loves its briefings, right? You got to do a briefing for every new thing you want to try and do. And there's good reason for that, because briefings ensure that the decisions we make are made with the fullest, most accurate information at our disposal. Well, think of this as briefing our political leadership. We are making sure leaders have all the information they have to make the best decisions possible. I also just want to offer what might be a paradigm shift for some. Rather than see my military spousehood as a liability when it comes to politics, I've come to see it as more of a responsibility, that I have the freedom to tell stories that my spouse and other spouses or other military members I know can't. I get to bridge the civ-mil divide that we talk so much about to make sure that their voices and perspectives are still represented. I know I've heard from a number of service members active duty service members who are grateful when I or other people I know speak up about things because they wish they could and they can't. And so I hope if you decide to get more vocal and get more engaged, that you have the same experience I have by feeling the profound gratitude that can come from the voices, the typically voiceless voices you are giving voice to. Well, not the most articulate ending to that sentence. Sorry, folks. But yeah. Okay, one more squishy thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'll pivot to answer a couple questions that might have come through. So some of us have a concern that has less to do with, the spouse, the career, whatever. It has more to do with us and our lives as military spouses and family members, knowing that this lifestyle can be at times really lonely and that it can be difficult to make friends and maintain those relationships. So the concern on the screen, what if my activism makes it harder to make or keep friends? I can relate to this a lot. So when I first started my career, I worked in DC, and then at some point I moved to join my spouse who was stationed in Nebraska. And I was afraid that it was going to be really hard to make friends with people who would understand what it was I had worked on or could relate to it at all. And so I thought that was kind of a part of my life that I was going to have to keep to myself and not share a lot about. Spoiler alert, didn't work out that way, but I'll share a couple thoughts about why that is. So first of all, I will just say my teammate Kate, who's behind the scenes, wrote a fantastic article on other squishy norms that I'll get to in a sec. But in her article, she quotes Dr. Brene Brown, who says, "Authentic friendships are the ones that you can share your vulnerability with," which I think is beautiful and really just points to that you have to ask yourself, would you want to be friends with someone if you couldn't be your full vocal self? Maybe you do. That's okay. Sometimes you just need what you got to get, right? But maybe you don't. And that's just something to keep in mind when you're deciding. Second of all, in my experience, even if someone you meet may at first be startled by the fact that you're active in general, but even specifically about something you say or something you believe, over time, people you're in relationship with are going to realize that you're a normal person and you are not the demonized version of whatever political trope it is that they have in their head. And over time, being your authentic self can help erode stereotypes that might exist. So if it helps to think of this in terms of playing the long game, that's certainly been my experience. I have friends now who are way more on board with a lot of the stuff that I talk about, just because I've been the one person in their life who bothered to talk about it. And in fact, my last thought is this: you may be surprised by how quickly raising your hand to speak up makes you a beacon that others look to who may be thinking the same thing. So I know my teammate Kate has said this happens to her a lot. She'll post something on social media and a spouse that she met at some event will see it and they'll reach out to her. They'll direct message her and say, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea you thought this thing. Let's be friends." And it may in fact be the start of a new friendship that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Like I said, you're not alone. A lot of us are out there who are really politically active. And so my hope is that by speaking up, you get more involved in those circles as well. All right, I will end the presentation by giving some example stories because I think it's cool to feel inspired by other spouses. But before I do, I'm going to remember this time to see if we have any questions from this second half. Okay, so we have what's not a question, but a comment. So from someone who is also a former command spouse, I think one of the things to consider as a leadership spouse is how another spouse or service member might feel if their political candidate or views aren't in line with yours. They may feel uncomfortable and perhaps choose to disengage from command support. Yeah, I think that's a really smart observation, that another reason you might want to, if you're in a position of leadership and you want to create some sort of distinction between kind of your personal political life and your role, is to keep this potential outcome in mind. And I know Kate, oh, this is Kate. Oh, I'm so sorry, Kate. This is Kate saying this comment. Kate's sharing that this was a concern when her husband was in command, and it was the only thing that made her hesitant, is that she wanted to make sure folks knew that they could continue to seek support from like official command structures.
Hi, can I butt in real quick?
Please.
The comment came from one of the attendees, and I was just adding my piece that when my husband was in command, it was a constant balance in my mind when it was sort of quote unquote worth speaking out. And there were issues, the current Black Lives Matter is a perfect example, when I felt that not speaking out was in fact making a statement. So there were times when I had to weigh, was my silence a form of complicity in saying that I was okay with things that were happening, which in turn might also alienate or make some people feel unwelcome, with speaking out and perhaps, you know, keeping quiet on something for fear of alienating other folks. So it is always a balance, I think, with that, especially when, as Sarah mentioned, in leadership or other positions, you have a lot more eyeballs and a lot more visibility. But, you know, the bottom line is you have to do what you're comfortable with. And it might change day to day, as Sarah mentioned, it might change issue to issue, and it might change based on your relationship with your spouse and just sort of, you know, what base or wing or squadron events look like. So, but I completely relate to that struggle.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. So Lisa shared, as a military spouse of 25 years and with a spouse still on active duty, I would suggest avoiding the statements head of households or old school. Many senior spouses have been the trailblazers to end the divide between spouses due to rank, social, cultural change, or advocacy for vulnerable populations. And that's a great point, Lisa. You're totally right. We are really lucky to stand on the shoulders of giants who have come before us. In fact, the first example story slide I'm going to share has some spouses who have been in the fight for over 25 years. And, you know, we are grateful for the progress that has been made for paving the way for future generations of spouses to be able to live lives according to how they see fit. I also see that you said also the services function very uniquely with traditions and boundaries. You may want to avoid Air Force jargon when speaking to all military spouses, like key spouse is an Air Force term. You're right. I know FRG, Family Readiness Group, is what the Navy uses. So we've got FRG leaders that we've connected with. And that's a great point. Usually I try to remind myself to be broader when I tend to think of things in Air Force terms, because that's the experience I've had. But that's a great point, that there are other leadership roles in different branches. And certainly, if you are in a different branch and something that you've encountered differs from what we've been talking about, please flag that for us. If, for instance, being an FRG leader has more strict requirements than being a key spouse in the Air Force, as an example, we'd love to better understand that. We have talked with some FRG leaders and haven't found that to be the case yet, but we want to be very transparent about both, you know, the limitations that come with our own personal experiences and the desire to continue to learn and expand the guidance that we can give. Julie mentions that not all Navy commands have FRGs, but there are ombudsmen. Yep. what I'd like to do is share examples of spouses I know who have gotten involved, both in apolitical advocacy and more partisan politics, because these are examples that I hope inspire you to see that there are multiple options that you can take. So for instance, there are countless spouses involved in apolitical advocacy, and some gals who I'd like to highlight in particular are these. So as many of you may know, last year Congress repealed what's called the widow's tax, which is a tax on survivors' benefits. And the women in this picture are three of the most powerhouse spouse advocates that we have to thank for that change. They spent decades steadily advocating for it and are a shining example of what can happen when you get involved and don't give up. Kind of a quote that really personifies the impact that they were able to have. TAPS, which is a phenomenal organization to help support survivors. Their policy director, Candace Wheeler, said this: "The most significant thing this year was the grassroots advocacy effort from the impacted spouses themselves. It was stellar. That is really what has been missing in the past." So a great, inspiring example of what can happen. And there are many other spouses as well. So all of the folks on this slide are folks I know personally. You've got Lena Steiner, who, and they all focus on different issues, which I think it's really cool to see the range. Lena Steiner, who took her 16-month-old to a senator coffee to talk about immigration reform. Lakeisha Cole, who has been a longtime advocate for military spouse employment issues. In the top right, you've got my teammate Kate, a picture taken from just the other week. And in the bottom row, you've got Jeremy Hilton, as long as some others who testified before Congress. That's how far their advocacy has taken them, whose focus has tended to be on healthcare issues. So great, inspiring examples of spouses involved in nonpartisan, apolitical, but still advocacy stuff. And then beyond that, there are plenty of us who have been involved in partisan politics before as well. I know spouses who have served as political appointees to the president, one who's been the public-facing spokesperson for a congressional candidate in Nebraska, another who was the campaign manager for a state-level race in Oregon. There is even an active duty spouse right now currently running for Congress in Missouri, and some who already hold office. So no matter what it is that you're thinking of trying, I guarantee that you're not alone. And in fact, to build off this, we did at SFI recently launch what we're calling our Spotlight series, where we highlight additional examples of military families getting involved in issues that matter to them. So if you have a story already that you'd like to share with us, or someone else that you think we should be highlighting, we would love to include you and them in our Spotlight series moving forward. All right. Jennifer has sent us her comment. So, as FRG/key spouse, we are supposed to be nonpartisan when in the role. I had a concern about dealing with other spouses in leadership who want to be vocal at family events. I want to support their opinions, but don't want to make others uncomfortable. Any advice on how to deal with those folks? Also great training. Thanks. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so it sounds like there are other spouses who want to be vocal at family events, and from what I can tell, so you yourself is what I'm guessing are in a leadership role, and are these spouses also in a leadership role or not? Because if they're not, well, I'll put it this way. I think I've seen in different branches within the military a move toward setting up events that are specifically geared for facilitating tough conversations about issues. For example, race. I know that I've seen different groups starting to say, hey, instead of leaving this issue untouched and seeing how it bubbles up, let's all get together and let's talk about this. And by having a concerted effort around it, you've got more facilitation that can make sure it's done in a way where folks understand that they can still access command support. And I think that I share that as in hopes that perhaps that might be a model that would be helpful for you to employ as well. If you get the sense that there are some events where folks just want to be social and other events where you want there to be more of an intentional conversation about issues, that might be one way of clearly distinguishing between the two. Otherwise, I mean, yeah, that's hard to manage when you get the impression that one spouse's overbearance may be another spouse's deterrence. I mean, yeah, that's tough to mitigate. And in your leadership role, my hope is that you're able to have one-on-one relationships with enough spouses that you can know what's happening and work forward with it. Okay, since we're getting toward the end, I want to make sure to share with folks some other stuff that you can get keyed in on. So there are obviously more concerns related to being political than just the more squishy concerns than the two that I touched on today. And so I wanted to make sure to highlight my teammate Kate wrote this great article called Being Political While Married to the Military that talks about a couple other things that might be on your mind. Incidentally, I also recently published an article about why your vote counts every time you vote, no matter the outcome of an election. So if you're looking for a more self-serving reason to vote, this might be an interesting article for you. Both of them have been published in Military Families magazine, so you can check them out there. If you'd like to continue this conversation, tomorrow we are actually going to be participating in a political engagement panel hosted by Partners in Promise. It'll be on Facebook Live on their profile, and this event is going to more emphasize our personal experiences rather than hard and fast rules. So if you're looking for more continued inspiration, check us out tomorrow. I'd also like to plug two other webinars. So we host other webinar topics, but two that might be particularly relevant for folks who are here today. First is answering tough questions. So if you dread Thanksgiving dinner because conversations with extended family never go well, or if you find yourself getting involved in more social media arguments about things, we offer a little formula that might be helpful to help de-escalate conversations and point them in a more constructive direction. And finally, we also are doing trainings on how to lobby your elected officials. So if you want to engage directly with political leadership and encourage them to vote a certain way or take a certain stance, we give kind of tips and tricks for how to most effectively change hearts and minds. So that's that. I really hope that this isn't the last we see of you. This is our website. We have all of the socials. Feel free to follow us there. Like I said, those are going to be the mechanisms through which we publish updated guidance and information that we gather, as well as that spotlight series and stories of other spouses. We hope that we can build a sense of community around spouses who all want to get involved and can support each other in that. So I certainly hope that we hear from you. Please feel free to reach us by email. If you have any other specific personal questions, maybe it's something you didn't think about in time to type out in the chat, we'd love to answer.